Welcome to the Project Schola podcast, brought to you by the Philos-Sophia Initiative Foundation, breaking through the barrier of scientific belief. I'm your host, John Trevor Berger, and I'm joined today by a very special guest, Ann Hartle, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy of Emory University in Atlanta. Today, we're going to be talking about the nature of philosophy and academic liberty, among other things. But perhaps most exciting of all for our purposes here, by the end of this episode, you should have a pretty good idea of what we mean exactly by this mysterious term, Schola. But before we get started, just want to remind everybody that Dr. Wolfgang Smith's latest book, Physics, a Science in Quest of an Ontology, is now available at philos-sophia.org. That's philos-sophia.org. You'll find a link directly to the product page in the show notes for that. The book is available in paperback for $19.95 and in hardcover for $35.95, and also in ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iBooks, and you can reach those through our product page. Also, if you haven't already, we invite you to watch our documentary film on the life and work of Dr. Smith, The End of Quantum Reality. Visit theendofquantumreality.com, where you can rent or buy on digital streaming, and you can also buy on DVD or Blu-ray. Again, that's theendofquantumreality.com. You might also be interested in the film's soundtrack, composed and performed by Richard Delano, available on digital streaming on all the major platforms, and it's also available on CD from our website shop. Finally, we currently offer annual membership subscriptions to the initiative for $45. Membership perks include a complimentary rental of The End of Quantum Reality, a link to download Rick Delano's hit theme song to the film, One Way Up, advance access to features like this podcast, new articles, some occasional member exclusive content, and more future content as time goes by and we grow. And again, you'll find the links to all this stuff in the show notes. Now, before getting started here and introducing our guest, just a couple remarks. Those of you who have been following the Project Schola podcast, which hasn't been around that long, but nevertheless, you may have sometimes wondered, well, what exactly do they mean by Schola anyway? And granted, while me and my co-host Brian Murphy have occasionally brushed up against the topic, we've yet to offer much in the way of a rigorous definition, really. Well, today you're in luck, because that's exactly one of the things my guest and I hope to achieve in this episode. And as with our previous episode featuring Professor Walid El-Ansari, you'll find that in this episode we break away somewhat from our more customary scientific topics. And today, especially, as we'll be really talking about philosophy as such, philosophy in its own right, philosophy as philosophy. And I think you'll all agree that it's certainly a worthwhile endeavor for a group that, after all, identifies itself as the Philos-Sophia initiative. That, that's something we ought to do at some point. Hopefully, what you'll take away from this segment, again, is a more rigorous definition of what we mean by Schola, and a better, at least generalized understanding of what we mean by philosophy, identifying some of the trademarks of good philosophy, which sadly is a rarity, as against bad philosophy, which abounds. In a nutshell, if Dr. Hartle and I are able to give some degree of satisfactory answer to the two questions, what is Philos-Sophia and what is Schola, I would say this episode will have been a success. So, that all being said, let's meet our guest, shall we? Professor Hartle, welcome, and how's the heat down in Atlanta?
Well, it's already too hot, too soon in Atlanta. So thank you for having me.
Great. So if I remember correctly, you taught at Emory University which for those of you who don't know is a pretty top tier private university in Atlanta, um, out just outside downtown. I think you began there in like what, 1985?
84.
84. And then you retired 2015, wasn't it?
Yeah,
So it's
2015.
hard to believe. I mean, because I remember when you retired and it was, and I was just counting the years just the other day. I can't believe it's been 8 years now. Time certainly flies. Now, where do you come from originally?
I come from New York. I lived the first part of my life in New York. And I went to college at a small liberal arts college in Brooklyn called St. Francis College.
Hmm.
And there I had wonderful teachers of philosophy and a real grounding in the question of the nature of philosophy, which was
Right.
always central there. And it is, in a certain way, of course, the philosophical question.
Uh,
What is
I,
philosophy?
I agree. I agree. It's the most philosophical of questions. I believe your erstwhile colleague and friend, Professor Livingston, said said what is the nature and worth of philosophy may not be the most important question, but it's certainly the most philosophical question.
Right,
Because it's
right,
philosophy is something which can turn back upon itself and ask what it is and still remain what it is, which
right,
other sciences cannot do. If you step back from physics and start asking what is physics, you're not doing physics anymore. You're now philosophizing about physics, which
right.
is very lost on a lot of physicists, certainly these days. But I think on the public as well. Now, out of curiosity, what part of New York were you from? New York, or upstate,
Well,
or
New York City, but
okay,
Queens, which is
Queens.
one of
Okay,
the 5 boroughs
sure,
of
sure. So
New
you went
York.
from Queens. So you sort of migrated from Queens to Brooklyn, academically speaking.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Um,
I didn't go very far.
yeah. Now the question you may have already kind of answered this question just from maybe it was just the turn of events, but I wonder what leads you, you're 18 years old and you think, I'm going to go to college. What led you to philosophy?
Well, I took my first philosophy course at St. Francis was entitled Philosophy of Being and Man.
Mhm.
And in that course, we read Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And very quickly into that course, I realized that this is what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. That I was just amazed that people actually spent their lives talking about these things. And I knew from that point on that that was what I wanted to do.
Well, that is interesting because those who have seen this podcast will already have noted that well, mainly Brian, even though, I mean, because I sent him this book, Leads with the Basis of Culture, because it was revolutionary to me as well. And ever since we started the Scola project idea, floated at first a few years ago, I was like, look, anybody who has anything to do with the Scola project, it is incumbent upon them to study this book, because this is what we're talking about, and it's from the book, the first few pages of the book, that he starts talking about Scola, what Scola is, and we'll get into that in a little while here. But that's interesting because I really personally, in the 20 years actually I've known you, I never did quite realize that it was that particular book that had this transformative effect on you. I mean, um, I knew Pieper was someone you were familiar with and everything else. but it didn't. That's certainly a revelation to me, and it ought to be encouraging to. It's I'll be interested to see what Murphy thinks of this, because we obviously came to the right person, invited the right person, because this is kind of the point of departure we want to come from, and Wolfgang is a big fan of this book as well, because he would have read it back in the original German. In any case, now for those of you who don't know, and it's kind of apropos what we've been talking about, Anne has the distinction of coming up with what, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the greatest conceivable book titles in the history of academic scholarship, and that is Death and the Disinterested Spectator, an inquiry into the nature of philosophy. Now, I'm not really clear on this. Was this your first book?
No, it was my second book.
Okay. Now, wasn't it based on your doctoral dissertation?
No, the first
No?
book was, which was about
Okay.
Rousseau,
Okay.
Rousseau's Confessions,
Right.
as a response to Augustine's Confessions.
Okay. Yeah, because I knew that was in there somewhere. I didn't know it fell in that order.
Right.
Now, in any case, as far as Death and the Disinterested Spectator, just because I think there's some relevancy to our topic today, what would you be able to give us a sort of upshot of that study?
Well, I actually, in that book, I talk about Socrates, Augustine, and Descartes, and with respect to what philosophy is. And it's there, I think, that we could begin to talk about the differences between premodern and modern philosophy, which is really crucial to this whole discussion, right? Because the difference between the Platonic Aristotelian view of philosophy and the Cartesian view. And this, of course, has a very direct relevance to Professor Smith's work, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Because we look to Descartes as the origin of modern philosophy. Now, actually, I think that origin is really earlier.
Right, and we're gonna be getting.
Pardon me?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, and that's something we're definitely going to be getting into. Is like,
Right.
yeah, the Descartes is we could say Descartes the father of modern philosophy, but we're going to be hearing today a good bit about who I call the godfather of modern philosophy.
Right, Machiavelli.
Correct.
All right.
I mean, Italian puns
All right, I
aside.
understand. I understand.
Now, incidentally, so subsequently, though, most of your work has been in the domain of modern political philosophy, with a special emphasis on Michel de Montaigne. Now, how did this come about, and what were some of the motivations that led you in this direction?
Well, I really, after studying philosophy at St. Francis, and while I was there and afterwards, I was very interested in this, what we could call the modern turn in philosophy. And whether it was good or bad, so to speak. What did it consist in? Because I was very much influenced in this by Professor Slade, Frank Slade, and Jerry Galligan and Joe Carpino, especially those three teachers, who all were interested in this turn from classical medieval philosophy on the one hand to modern philosophy on the other hand, that there wasn't just a kind of progression, that philosophy didn't make progress, so to speak, but that with early modern philosophy, there was a very essential, fundamental change in the meaning of what philosophy is. And that's where my focus has always been. And that led me to Montaigne.
Gotcha.
As a predecessor of Descartes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I think we see in Montaigne, we see what could be called modern consciousness before we see it in Descartes.
Right, right. Now, you may or may not have a quick answer to this, but just in closing out this particular question, I wonder if somebody were to ask you, well, okay, what has been the most important lesson you learned from these studies? I suppose that crux of modernity, that really it's a break. And also maybe Montaigne in particular, that, what would be the sort of nutshell thing that you would perhaps tell people about that, like here's the most important thing I've learned, that kind of thing.
Well, the most important thing I learned after studying Montaigne for roughly 25 years uh, is the my description of modern philosophy would be that modern philosophy is self-consciousness and what that means, right? And so, whereas pre-modern philosophy is not self-conscious, pre-modern philosophy focuses, let's just say, outward on the world and on God. The mind is drawn to the intelligibility of the world and
Right,
of God. In modern philosophy, there's this reflexive turn where the mind turns back on itself
right.
and everything begins to be seen through that lens, that it's always the philosopher looking not directly at the world, but as at his own mind.
Hmm.
That's where you get that Cartesian skepticism
Hmm.
and where
Yeah,
you get Descartes' cogito. I
yeah,
think, therefore I am.
y- yeah,
So I would say that was the most important breakthrough for me
yeah,
uh, in my work on Montaigne.
yeah. And that's interesting, because the apologist for modernity, I think, would say, well, self-consciousness, we're fulfilling the Delphic injunction, know thyself. But I think we would have to conclude from that that know thyself in a pre-modern sense, there's a different import than merely reflexivity, or it's, I mean, my inclination is to think that in order to know yourself, you first must know the world. It's through engagement with the world that self-knowledge comes about. You can't get to the world from self-knowledge. And here we have bifurcationism, um, Descartes' res cogitans, um, the subjectivism, not merely subjectivity, but subjectivism in modern thought, and that disconnect from the world. Now, you mentioned Francis Slade, who is for those of you who don't know, the late political philosopher. Didn't publish a whole lot, but everything he did publish is golden. He really clarifies modernity in an important way, and obviously, as Dr. Hartle mentioned, she's a student of him, and the other people I know of or have read that are proteges of Slade as well are phenomenal thinkers. The one that most readily comes to mind is Robert Sokolowski, um, and also there was the late Thomas Proofer, who was a childhood friend of Slade, and also a friend and colleague of Robert Sokolowski. Um, and a few years back, you wrote something in, I believe there was a symposium, a Slade symposium. I think it was in 2016. And I think that this was published in the journal, was it called Perspectives on Political Science? Was that the name of it?
Yeah. Right.
Okay. And and you had a lot of interesting things to say in that. And you show a lot of interesting things that Frank posited within that, and there's a lot of relationship to this question of Scola, which incidentally we should remind the audience here that Scola is well, the title of Pieper's books was, leisure, the basis of culture. Well, this is where Schola comes from. The Greek skole uh, is the term for leisure, and this in Latin, typically in Latin, a lot of people have heard, the term for leisure usually is otium, which is distinguished from negotium, which is essentially business. And negotiums where we get words like negotiation, negotiate. So there's a direct understanding to business, but obviously, but the thing to note there, just in passing, is that ne particle at the beginning, negotium is essentially the absence of leisure. It's defined in the negative. The primary thing is leisure, otium. But an equivalent term, relatively equivalent, though I think a little bit richer in Latin, which we've chosen, is Scola with the ch, schola, which is, I think, has a little bit richer connotation than either the Greek skole or the Latin otium, because obviously it doesn't take an etymologist to see that, for English speakers at least, that, Scola, obviously this is the root of school, of scholar, scholarship, and such words. But and evidently the Latins would have understood Schola probably as school, but it would have come with that connotation of school as a domain of leisure. Now, I wonder if, Dr. Hartle, we could go ahead and talk about this a little bit. In particular, you talk about the modern philosophy's sort of embarrassment at its own weakness, and the leisure as contemplation, philosophy as contemplation, and how Machiavelli sort of overthrows this in his analysis, which is an interesting point before we get going here. Is an interesting figure, I suppose, for listeners here to hear, because, well, isn't Machiavelli the guy who wrote The Prince? Isn't this just a political thinker? Well, as you'll see, he's a little bit more than just that. He is primarily a political thinker, but in order to reach the position at which he arrived, you have to make a lot of metaphysical and epistemological assumptions, which are really a pre-Cartesian Cartesianism in a way, in order to instigate the kind of turn toward the state, or as Hobbes would call it, the sovereign. So there's an intimate connection. So if everyone will bear with us, I think you'll see the connection here to political philosophy is not far off the beaten track from what we're talking about at the initiative. So in any case, Anne, do you have any thoughts you want to get us started with on that?
Yeah, well, if you and here I'm in good measure following Slade's line of thinking.
Right.
Modern philosophy has what we might call two branches. The epistemological branch, which typically is traced back to Descartes, and political philosophy, which begins with Machiavelli. But what both of those branches have in common, what's behind them, is this radically new understanding of what philosophy is. And so in Descartes, where you have the scientific, the natural sciences, the modern sciences coming out of that, Descartes says that what he is all about is the mastery of nature. His famous line in the Discourse on Method that this will make us masters and possessors of nature. Breaking with philosophy as contemplative for the sake of simply knowing. No, it's no longer for the sake of simply knowing. It's for the sake of mastery. And the same thing in political philosophy, because what Machiavelli says, his most very famous expression, we should give up all of this ancient talk about the best city. We should be, quote unquote, realistic, because what we're interested in is what he calls the effectual truth, the effectual truth. So now you have both in the epistemological and the political philosophy branches of modern philosophy are about making philosophy work, so to speak, for the alleviation of the human condition. And that is just a very radically different understanding of what philosophy is, because in both classical and medieval thought, philosophy is the highest activity of philosophy is contemplation, beholding the truth of things, not doing anything with it. So the philosopher doesn't want to master the world. He wants to understand it. Aristotle in the Politics, he doesn't want to rule. The politics is not telling you, okay, this is what you need to do. Get your act together and let's make politics, work for us and so forth. It's not prescriptive, it's descriptive.
Right.
It's theoretical. Theoria, the term theoria is the term, to behold.
Ah.
Okay. So this is the radical difference that it really comes down to between pre-modern and modern philosophy. And Pieper, of course, is defending that ancient view.
Mm-hmm.
That ancient, and by the way, it's noteworthy. Pieper was a student of Thomas Aquinas,
Mm-hmm.
the scholastic, right? It's the schools,
Mm-hmm.
the philosophy of the schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the real difference here. And this is where we can see, I think, I see a kind of similarity between what Frank Slade was doing and what Wolfgang Smith is doing.
Yeah.
In this respect, that they're both taking a step back and looking at, on the one hand, modern physics, and on the other hand, modern political philosophy, and saying something in this turn to modernity, something has to be looked at. Something is lost, or something is radically changed in a way that is not necessarily good.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I understand his work, Wolfgang Smith, in that very crucial distinction between the physical and the corporeal.
Right.
That's it. That's the modern turn to the physical and away from the corporeal. And the way Frank Slade puts it with respect to Machiavelli is, he says, Machiavelli abandons the natural attitude towards politics. The natural attitude towards politics, which is the Aristotelian attitude, right? what's the best regime, the question of justice and injustice, Machiavelli abandons that for the effectual truth. What is effective rule going to look like? Right. And that's not Aristotle's question. So,
Yeah.
and I would say, in a certain way, as I understand Professor Smith's work, he's saying what happens when you move from the corporeal to the physical, you're abandoning the natural attitude towards the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
You're not talking about the senses anymore.
Right.
Or another way to put it would be the human involvement in the world. The modern philosopher has to step out of that and take this quote unquote objective stance towards the world. And therefore you get introduced this distinction between objective and subjective, which does not exist in pre-modern philosophy.
By the bifurcation as epistemology in particular, is at the foundation of the scientific. So you can almost say the epistemic and scientific preoccupation of modern philosophy and the political. So those, that and then that. And of course, PSIF, we tend to focus on the former. But, for the complete critique of modernity and the coincident recovery of tradition, this political sphere does have to be addressed as well, I think. So as Rick Delano used to say, culture is downstream of physics. But on the other hand, there are also political presuppositions which have the same effect, that the true basis of culture is leisure. It's only by leisure that we can see those errors which have led to the crisis of modernity. And in effect, the fathers of modern philosophy declared once and for all what our axioms for everything are supposed to be. And we go forth, even in the philosophical quest, without questioning those. And what I think both Frank, Slade, and Wolfgang have done is go to the root. And you could say culture is downstream of physics and whatnot, but the point is there's a more foundational issue here. Wolfgang's rehashing of the modern sciences enables him to reclaim the ground of truth, which is at the heart of sound morality and the common good. In other words, the scientific and the moral political domains are not meant, knowledge is one. I mean, they're not really independent from one another. I mean, there's a wholeness there that's lost by trying to achieve all of this effectual truth. And what we think of as scientific truth actually does have it has direct and indirect effects on the moral and political life and the common good.
I think a parallel here between Slade and Wolfgang Smith might be something like this. I mean, Slade was ultimately interested in the fundamental philosophical questions of first philosophy. And he approached it through political philosophy. He wasn't a political philosopher in the narrow sense of a political scientist, but he wanted to get back to, okay, what is man's place in the world? What is man's relationship to God? These are fun. And I think Wolfgang Smith is doing the same thing with respect to physics, so that to me, it's very meaningful when you say that this is physics in search of an ontology. I see Frank essentially doing something like that with respect to, what are the ontological or metaphysical presuppositions of modern political philosophy?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I just want to say one thing. You touched on it before, but with respect to leisure, it's very, very noteworthy that Machiavelli, especially not so much in The Prince, but in the Discourse on Method.
You mean Descartes?
No,
Discourse on
I'm
Method
sorry,
was,
in the discourses on living,
you're right, yeah.
Machiavelli attacks leisure
Ah,
directly. And he attacks it in a very interesting way. He doesn't call it leisure, he calls it idleness.
right.
The attack on idleness is by calling it idleness, just that very act of calling it idleness, which is a
Reduces it.
derogatory term,
Yeah.
when leisure, he attacks it, and he says that in order to have a republic, you have to eliminate the idle rich. Now that has very amazing implications,
Yeah.
not good implications for what happens in modern. Just to bring it back to the
Yeah.
whole question of leisure.
Yeah. I mean, in your piece, well, let me just read this. So, premodern philosophy rules by being a constituent of the natural hierarchy, thus determining what the limits of political rule should be. Machiavelli rules by destroying the natural hierarchy. For when philosophy is removed from its place as the highest within the natural hierarchy of ends, the hierarchy collapses. Machiavelli's destruction of the hierarchy can be seen in his attack on leisure, as you just referenced, and I'm quoting you here, which is an attack on the presence of the higher things, quote unquote. The attack on leisure takes the form of an attack on idleness. By identifying leisure with idleness, Machiavelli is calling into question the very foundation of pre-modern civilization, which sees leisure as the necessary condition for both philosophy and the noble character. So my comment on that is simply that you can make a whipping boy of leisure by renaming it, by just reducing it to idleness. Similarly, you can reduce the significance of philosophy from the epistemic scientific point of vantage by saying that, well, philosophy is useless, which really is its glory. That's part of something we probably want to mention at some point here. The uselessness of philosophy is that's what makes it the science of a free man, because it serves no end beyond itself. It's an end in, of, and for itself, and that's what leisure is about. Is that she is engaging in that activity, and in Machiavelli, you have a reduction of leisure to idleness, which makes it open to attack. And with Cartesianism, you have a reduction of philosophy, or a sort of, you could say, an elimination of philosophy as such, in order to make it subservient. Well, as you, I think, pointed out somewhere, or as Slade may have, make it a sort of, they say, like in the Middle Ages, they called philosophy the handmaiden of theology. Well, in our time, philosophy is seen as like just a mere handmaiden to science, which is what you see especially in our Anglo-American tradition of the 20th century. And also, I wanted to just mention regarding what you said about this overlap between what Wolfgang is doing, and what Frank has done. This recognition of the possibility of doing philosophy again. Well, let me take a step back and say, and I think again you'll agree that this is there's really a perfect, well, certainly an analogy between Slade and Smith here. um you know Wolfgang is a true philosopher of physics, because he doesn't just talk about physics. He talks about, philosopher of physics, will not only interpret physics, but also show where it fits into the whole. I mean, there's a great definition by Robert Sokolowski of the nature of philosophy. He calls it, he refers to philosophy as the science of the whole, which the rest of the sciences are partial sciences. And he says that, like, for instance, take somebody who's a philosopher of language, touts himself as a philosopher of language. He said, and Sokolowski says, if, you say to a philosopher of language, if a questioner asks them, well, you're asking me things about change and stability and images and memories. I don't know about such things. I can only talk about language. Sokolowski says, well, such a reply would indicate that the speaker has become a linguist, not a philosopher.
Right.
Because if he presents himself as a philosopher of language, he has to be able to show how language fits into the whole of things. Now, getting back to Wolfgang on this point, Wolfgang is really an exceptionally characteristic of this criterion that Sokolowski spells out, especially in the work he's been doing the last few years here, because in proper fashion for a philosopher of physics, he not only gives a rigorous accounting of physics on sound ontological grounds, but he also shows how physics and the objects of physics fit in to the whole of reality. No doubt to the chagrin of many in our time, I mean, his verdict is that where the physical fits in is at the lowest tier of existence. And to add insult to injury, he actually says that the physical domain is sub-existential because it's characterized by quantitative attributes, and there are no real essences or substance. And this, of course, flies in the face of what everybody nowadays believes, namely that science, or the science of physics, is the ultimate arbiter of reality. So in Wolfgang, we have this experienced mathematical physicist who, in his capacity as a philosopher, is telling us just the opposite of the common belief about the role of physics. And specifically, he's telling us that physics is concerned with the bottom of the cosmos, technically just below the bottom, in between being and nothingness, at least especially with respect to quantum physics. And the idea of quantum reality, or that there's some spooky atomic realm, for example, I mean, the common belief is that in going further and further downward, we're getting closer and closer to the heart of the really real. But the truth is the exact opposite. In other words, as we descend further downward, we're actually moving further away from reality, not closer to it. And so anyways, this recognition opens up to us the possibility of philosophy again. And here I'm getting back to Slade, connection to Slade here in just a second. I mean, in light of Wolfgang's discoveries, we can say that philosophy is actually the superior science to physics in principle. And what I think is so what Wolfgang tells us about the status of physics, or the physical, with respect to philosophy, appears to be rather analogous to what Slade says about the status of politics, or the political, with respect to philosophy, which is kind of what you were saying earlier. And interestingly enough, Wolfgang's philosophy of physics is a sort of stepping stone to philosophy liberated from physics. It's really a new kind of, it's like he's kind of redefined the physics and metaphysics, I mean, for our purposes, in the sense that, physics starts from the physical. Well, in modern physics, ta meta ta physica, there's beyond physics in the modern sense is different than beyond physics in like Aristotle's sense. Of course, Aristotle, we know, didn't say metaphysics, but still. So with Wolfgang, we have this new and refined sense in which physica means modern physics or quantum physics. Similarly, Slade's political thought is a stepping stone to philosophy liberated from politics. It's, ta meta ta politica. It's like, I mean, that's how I think of it. It's like a meta politics. Both Wolfgang and Frank use this contrast between modern and pre-modern forms of their particular special sciences, political, physical, to ascend to philosophy proper, or what Aristotle would call first philosophy.
to the extent that I understand Wolfgang Smith's work, typically when we speak about somebody as a philosopher of science, what we're talking about are people who just try to understand what science is. They're not going beyond it to look at the metaphysical presuppositions. They're very narrow. When I look at Professor Smith's work, I see a kind of return to the premodern notion of a philosophy of nature or a cosmology.
Absolutely.
It's just not done anymore.
Or those who do it,
some people do.
or those who do it rather badly.
Yes, yes, exactly. And so that's kind of how I would from my perspective, how I would describe it, because philosophers don't do philosophy of nature anymore. They do philosophy of science.
Mm-hmm.
So because the natural sciences have taken over that whole domain of nature
Mm-hmm.
from philosophy. And that is not the pre-modern view. I mean, everything that Aristotle did was philosophy, and he did biology, physics. So
Yeah.
that unity of the sciences is there in him, whereas
Yeah.
that's no longer the case.
And that's something, yeah, that's definitely something you see in Wolfgang, is that there's a kind of unity of the sciences. I mean, they're distinct, obviously, but there's, I always say his rehashing of modern sciences based upon his foundational discoveries of, the distinction with a capital D, as I call it, meaning the distinction between the physical and the corporeal, with the distinction and vertical causation, and his new, more Platonic ontology of physics, where the irreducible wholeness comes into the picture. Irreducible wholeness being the effect of vertical causation, and also the source of vertical causes, the ultimate source of vertical causes. One of the things that Frank talks about is, as being a kind of signature of modernity, is the rejection of teleology. And what's really fascinating is that he identifies this with respect to both of these two primary focal points of modern thought, the political and the epistemological, epistemologico-scientific, or however you want to put it. He says, typically we think of modernity commencing with mathematical physics, which consists of the rejection of ends, telos, and the construction of forms. But he says, but also we have this in modern political philosophy as well. We have the rejection of ends and the construction of forms. The state, in fact, the sovereign state, is something which has literally been thought into existence by modern political philosophers, and the state prior to modernity did not exist, which is really either, in my experience, has been either really illuminating to people or really confusing to people, because they think, well, then what was before? What do you call that? But we don't have to get into all that. I mean, I think that proper term is regime, but or polis, certainly in the Greek world. But another thing too I'd like to mention before posing a question here is that Slade, as you know, makes a really excellent distinction between ends and purpose.
Right.
A lot of people tend to think of them as the same thing, but you need a person to have a purpose. So he says purposes are psychological, ends are ontological. They're given by nature. So strictly speaking, you can't Pache, the intelligent design folk, you can't really say that nature has purpose, because unless you want to get into a theological discussion, which is feasible, but it's not really taking advantage of what teleology is really about, of what it really, of how, of the possibilities of understanding what telos means, which is an end. And in a sense, it's to be, for a thing to be that which it is my understanding in a nutshell of what an end is. So with that clarification in mind,
Yeah, well, I think that's a good way to put it. For ends are given to us by our very nature, but what we are by nature. And we can choose to act in accordance with that or not. Human beings, animals can't make the choice. Human beings can make that choice. And so just to put it back into what we've been talking about,
mm-hmm.
the naturally given end of the intellect is contemplation on this view. In other words, that is how the mind of man is fulfilled and satisfied. We don't choose what will satisfy us. We're told what will satisfy us. Nature tells us what will satisfy us. And the naturally given end of political association is the common good.
Right.
Now, both of those are rejected in modern philosophy. Forget about the natural end of the intellect as contemplation. That's useless. It's helpless, powerless, weak. And forget the common good. What political association is an expression of the will of men. It's a contract, right?
Well, didn't you say that in your article that the common good is replaced, Aristotle's common good is replaced by Rousseau's general will?
Right, exactly. And that's just a huge shift. Common good, general will. Because the general will is always right just because it's the will. But it can be disastrously wrong looked at from the point of view of wisdom, right? So that's in both the epistemological and the political branches of modern philosophy, you see that same rejection of teleology, a naturally given end.
Right. Well, one of the things that I understand the initiative to be largely about, and certainly the Scola project as a subset of that, is the critique of modernity and the recovery of tradition. And I think if the rejection of teleology is, as Slade argues, the sort of signature of modernity, then certainly the restoration of teleology is a necessary condition for, well, not only for the critique of modernity, but for that recovery of tradition.
The way kind of I see the Schola initiative goes something like this. And again, correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But on the view of that there are naturally given ends, the end of the university is the pursuit of truth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that's just been completely abandoned. Now the end of the university is any social justice, right?
And just to jump in, and also I think what you said of effectual truth,
Right.
I mean, STEM, functionary, to become a functionary. Anyways, go ahead.
No, so I mean, I see the Schola initiative as recovering that view of what the university is really about, what school is really about. So it's the contemplative, theoretical side of things. It's that kind of recovery.
Right. Yeah, there's something that you said. Well, let's see. I'm not sure. It came from the article I mentioned that you wrote, but I'm not sure if it's you who said this or it was Frank who said this. But I think it's kind of the heart of the Scola project. Quote, leisure and philosophy are essential to human freedom, for they show that human beings are themselves free, that they exist for themselves and are not simply instruments. Furthermore, leisure has its origin in religion, specifically in divine worship, which removes not only the philosopher, but all of the citizens from the world of work. If the completion and perfection of human nature is freedom from the merely useful, then human nature as such possesses that inherent dignity. Now,
That's really right out of Pieper.
yeah, right. And you may have been actually commenting on Pieper when saying that, because I think it was right after your mention of Pieper's remark on philosophical theoria as as quote an indispensable constituent of the common good itself. In other words, even though we may be by ourselves, but we are nevertheless effecting good in the world. It's for the common good. Well, there's a really fascinating thing I learned a long time ago from this priest who gave the example of a traditional Jewish household. And I think this is a great analogy for what leisure is all about. In a traditional Jewish household, apparently, you have the whole family that lives in the house. Everybody has some task to do or tasks, but there's one man who devotes all of his time to studying the Torah. And one might think, well, okay, what does that do? But in the Hebrew understanding, which I think makes perfect sense, it is for the good of the entire family that one man is devoted to this task of Torah scholarship, so to speak. And I think I always thought that was a great illustration of kind of what
Yeah,
we're talking about.
right. It
Uh,
is.
and I mentioned in the quote that I mentioned, and certainly this is from Pieper. Pieper talks about leisure having its origin in religion and the culture. Culture, leisure, the basis of culture. Leisure is the basis of culture, and culture comes from cultus and religious uh, ritual sacrifice, divine worship, and so forth. And something that we always take pains to remind people of is that we're the Philos-Sophia Initiative Foundation is not a religious outfit. In other words, we're not proselytizers, we're not preaching, but uh, as one sees in Wolfgang's writings himself, it's not like you can't. It's not like religion is an off subject. It's not like something you can't talk about. I mean, true philosophy is open to all voices: scientific, religious, theological, artistic, um, what have you. Um, because philosophy, as Sokolowski that says, is the science of the whole. You want to see things in the most comprehensive context. So I just wanted to make that point apropos the role of religion.
Right.
I wanted to step a minute into this question about we talk about bifurcation a lot because of Wolfgang's critique of modern physics hinges upon the recognition that bifurcation of reality into thought and extension, as per Descartes' distinction between res cogitans and res extensa, the extended being the purely objective, measurable world. With respect to the rejection of teleology, I've sometimes wondered whether bifurcation is a sort of prerequisite to making the rejection of teleology possible, or if it's just the reverse of that, or if bifurcationism is simply one more instance of the rejection of teleology. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Um, one way of describing the modern turn, as it's
Mm-hmm.
been called,
Modern turn, right?
is this understanding of the human being I would say, shifts from the understanding of the human being as the rational animal. Man is an animal with reason, right? He's an animal just like a horse, but with that distinguishing feature of reason. Now, that's a very important distinction, to be sure. But the point being that he's an animal, and that's how he is in the world of the senses. And there's a unity within the human being there of the rational animal.
Mm-hmm.
What happens with modern philosophy is you get the mind-body problem. There is no mind-body problem in pre-modern philosophy. So what you get with the view of the human being that you get in modern thought is the human being bifurcated into the mind, which is this objective observer, and the animal body, which is not really part of one's humanity, if I could put it that way. It's a kind of Gnosticism.
It's an extension. The body is extended in
Yeah,
space.
and it's not part of the mind.
Right.
So you've lost that unity of the rational animal, and that's your trade-off for the mastery of nature.
You know, at the initiative, we often remind people, and I bring this up mainly because of what you said about rational animal and reason. I think we can use reason as a generalized term, personally, describing the overall peculiarity of humanity. But strictly speaking, as we know, there's a more precise definition of reason, which comes directly from ratio as opposed to intellectus. And
good, that's perfect. I was using rational animal just in the,
of course,
just such a definition
absolutely
type thing. But really what Aristotle says, for example, is man is the animal with the logos.
Wow.
That sense of rationality as the logos, the order of things.
Wow.
So it includes intellect and reason.
Yes.
Not just
yes.
So you're perfectly right
that makes
make
sense. That and I'm glad you said that, because that makes a lot of sense about the logos. I mean, I sometimes wonder, in fact, how much we've lost from the original Greek when we read things in English. I mean, there's a friend of ours he's a biologist, but he's also a profound metaphysical thinker as well. And we're going to have him on the show, hopefully in a month or two. But I could be wrong. I don't think I am, but I'm pretty sure he he studies Plato and Aristotle in the original Greek, or at the very least he's very familiar with the import of the Greek within the writings, because like for instance, he said to me one time that the Aristotle of like the Neo-Thomists and whatnot, he says, I mean, it's really Latin Avero, what they called in the Middle Ages, Latin Averoism. I mean, he said, this is really, he said, this is an Aristotle I don't even recognize. And the fact is that, well, Lloyd Gerson, who I think you're familiar with, a great scholar of Platonism, of Neoplatonism, this is another one of those great book titles, Aristotle and Other Platonists, because Aristotle was a member in good standing in the academy, throughout his life. I mean, and as a matter of fact, the curriculum at the Platonic Academy, before studying the dialogues and the more the alleged unwritten doctrines of Plato, which came out in the Neoplatonists, they actually began the curriculum with Aristotle, because they saw the study of nature as a important prerequisite, and before anything they studied the categories of Aristotle. In fact, the Neoplatonist Porphyry wrote a very famous treatise, the Isagogy, which is an introduction to the categories. So Aristotle was extremely important to the classical Platonists. I mean, they call Neoplatonists, but I mean, from what I can tell, I want to give them a prefix. It seems to me they're more like the Paleo-Platonists, bringing back out into the open like the old esoteric doctrine of the academy. Allegedly, Plato, the dialogues are more exoteric, and the esoteric doctrines were for the initiates, because there was a sort of a religious component to the academic life, in the sense of the academy, the academic life in the old academy. But now I saw recently a talk that you gave at Emory University a few years ago. I think it was part of some great books thing or whatever. You were talking about Montaigne and civility, which is the subject of a recent work you did. I believe it was called "What Happened to Civility,"
Mhm.
which I didn't even know had been published, and you were even working on until after it had been out and published. I stumbled upon it by accident, but there was something you said, and I think this relates to what you said about logos, about the word being a connection, sort of being the true integrating principle for intellect and reason, so to speak. And you quoted from Montaigne something which was really interesting, because when you said this, I'm about to quote it really quick. It's just a sentence, but after you quoted this, there was like rumbles of illumination you could hear in the lecture hall. You know, it came off. I mean, it's one of those things that came off like we've never heard anything like that before, and yet it's so obvious. But anyway, so Montaigne, you quoted him as saying, "Lying is such a destructive vice because we are men and hold together only by our word, logos," just making that connection here. "Truth is the first and fundamental part of virtue, and the first stage in the corruption of morals is the banishment of truth." And as I said, suddenly, like, everyone was just sort of like, "Oh, well, you can hear all this mumbling in the background." And it reminds me of something you wrote in Death and the Disinterested Spectator. You were talking about how philosophy begins in wonder, and the peculiar character of philosophical wonder versus ordinary wonder. And what you said about philosophical wonder is that much of what the philosopher does is instill wonder by the statement of things that we basically already know. And so philosophy has this character of always being a perennial starting over and about new beginnings. But that's just kind of a side point. The main point here is, I think that this question of civility has a direct bearing, not just in the political sphere, but also in the scientific discourse. I mean, you talked about open communication and frankness, and I think this is important with respect to the sphere of scientific discourse, because there are certain objections and counter arguments one can raise against evolution, for example, and which will literally evoke like offense. I mean, strictly speaking, I think scientific mind ought to be immune from being offended. I mean, granted, I suppose one could say that a mind honestly devoted to truth may find falsehood to be offensive, but it's not personal. It's not like people feeling like they're being like a person. People take it like a personal attack. Really, what we have in scientific discourse as well is an incivility, and that's like at the basis of both of these fields. Once again, we have the political and the scientific. And I think that your discussion of civility is pertinent to this really everything we've been talking about. And I guess my question would be, well, would you agree with that? And also, I think the question would be, would you agree that civility is necessary for philosophical discourse in general?
Yeah, I think across the board, it's and I see what you mean about science. I mean, the idea that there is a consensus about certain scientific things,
Yeah.
and if you disagree with that, you're beyond the pale and you're not even worth talking to, is the antithesis of what I would think of as the proper attitude of the scientist.
And
right?
it's in civil.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they want to exclude you from the conversation. You're just beyond the pale. And this has happened in so many domains. In the political, certainly, but in the philosophical, somebody just sent me an article about philosophers and what you can no longer say, what you can no longer call into question as a philosopher. Well, there shouldn't be anything that you can't call into question
Yeah.
as a philosopher.
Yeah.
So I agree, the kind of civility that you're talking about, I agree, it's essential across the board. And one of the points I was trying to make in that book, and I do talk in one of the chapters, I talk about the university and how the university ought to prepare the civil character of the student, is exactly that openness to hearing other opinions. Right. And being able to argue very passionately and very vehemently for your own position, but always with this attitude of openness to other views.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
that's where that skepticism that you
yeah.
talked about
Yeah. That's
comes in.
something. Yeah. Because I think, wouldn't you agree that skepticism, not per se I don't mean the doctrine of Sextus Empiricus, for instance,
Right.
but a certain degree of skepticism is sort of a criterion for philosophical, I would say philosophical maturity, but even just the philosophical discourse in general.
Yes, I would agree with that. And there has to be this willingness of calling your own most cherished beliefs into question.
Yeah, because because the actual Greek origins, skepticism isn't just doubt, it's consideration, inquiry, reflection.
Right.
But so in any case, apropos what I said in the beginning about how we'd be essentially answering the two questions: what is Philos-Sophia, what is Schola, which I think we've pretty much done. But I think one of the things that emerges from everything we've been talking about is that the two, I hesitate to say that they're synonymous, but they're definitely very intimately connected. I mean, certainly I would say that I would identify bona fide leisure with the truest spirit of what education is. And I mean, personally, uh, I tend to think of education, philosophy, and leisure as almost interchangeable terms, so long as they're defined the right way. But basically, though, you could say that Scola or leisure is that activity or even state of being wherein education and philosophy meet, or perhaps one could say that Schola is philosophical education.
No,
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot that could be said about it,
right,
spelling it out, but I think that
right.
that's a good beginning.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's just about a wrap for today. I hope, I mean, I think this could be a watershed episode. We haven't done anything like this before. Granted, we haven't been around that long, but I hope people really pay attention to it, because I think we've hit on some really important issues here. And speaking of which, with respect to these themes, really quickly, that we've been discussing the nature of philosophy, liberal education, we didn't get quite as deeply into that, but we brushed up against it, or even special angles of political philosophy as the philosophy of the common good. I wonder if for people you may have any, if you happen to think of anything off the top of your head of like reading recommendations.
Well, I begin where we started, and that's with Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture.
Right.
And another one of Pieper's books that's been very important for me is his book on tradition,
Right.
because there he talks about the relationship between tradition and philosophy, and how to truly do philosophy is to stand within a tradition. So I would highly recommend those
Gotcha.
as good starting points for the topics that we are talking about.
I would also from my part, I'd also throw in there, as long as we're talking about Pieper, his book In Defense of Philosophy,
Right.
which really I think is kind of an expanding upon Leisure, the Basis of Culture. Anyways, as for Wolfgang's books, just to remind everybody, his latest, Physics, a Science in Quest of an Ontology, is now available. You might also be interested in his previous book, The Vertical Ascent, as well as the third PSIF edition of his 1984 classic, Cosmos and Transcendence, which we republished last year. And we're still working to republish all Wolfgang's books in-house by the Foundation. Working on it, bear with us. Also, don't miss our documentary film on the life and work of Dr. Smith, The End of Quantum Reality, as well as the masterful soundtrack to the film, scored and performed by Richard Delano. And finally, as always, we invite you to consider becoming a member of the initiative, and you'll find the links for this and all of the above in the show notes. So thanks again, everybody, and a very special thanks, Professor Hartle, for illuminating us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Again, I think this has been an invaluable contribution to the podcast, and it's been a great service to our initiative. And maybe we'll see you again at some point down the road.
Thank you.
Way up, one way up, one way up, way up. Of all the superstitions to arise beneath the sun. Today the theoreticians hold the very greatest one.